In 1975, the United States of America had 21,310 murders. Of these, there were an unusually high number of bludgeoning murders, 1,001. In the state of Connecticut, there was a particular bludgeoning murder that year that continues to be talked about till present day, the Martha Moxley murder. Martha's death was added to a growing number of unsolved murders in Greenwich. Naturally, the police were blamed, with allegations ranging from incompetence to corruption. Now it was time for them to get some help from the more experienced Detroit police. Could they crack the case? Or was the lack of movement less to do with incompetence and more to do with the money and power of the suspects? Welcome to True Crime with Morty, a podcast by a criminologist and her dog. I am your host TJ, and this is Morty. Each week we'll be doing deep dives into murders and mysteries from all around the globe, using my background in law and criminology to give a full account of true crime stories. If that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing, and thank you for joining us today. This is episode 4 in the series Mystery on Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley murder. Winter 1976. The residents of Belle Haven, Connecticut are fearful. Martha's murderer has not been apprehended, and most believe it is someone who lives in Belle Haven. Sheila McGrath is walking home from school, and she notices she's being followed by a silver car. Sheila has been plagued by nightmares since she found Martha's body, and on seeing a silver car she panics, as on the day that she found Martha, when she had discovered her body, she saw a silver car drive away at speed down the road, and at the time it panicked her, but she had a bigger concern, that was she'd found her friend. And so when she sees a silver car following home from school, she worries that it was the murderer who killed Martha, has stalked her, and is now following her home, and she runs to a neighbour's house. In addition to Sheila's troubles, a girl called Margaret Moore seems to be the next target of this killer. Margaret was 15 years old and also lived on Walsh Lane. On January 3rd, 1976, she was babysitting for Dr. James Spencer on Field Point Road. He drops her home at around midnight, and then a call comes through to the house. A mysterious caller whispers, "You're next. You're next." At first, Dr. Spencer is just confused. He has no idea why this person is calling. Then he realises that the call may have been from Margaret, and that Margaret is a 15-year-old girl from Walsh Lane who reminds him of the late Martha Moxley. Concerned, the doctor calls police. The police take it seriously, and they inform the Moore family, who are also very frightened. 2 days later, the Moore family received their own midnight phone call. This time, the caller does not speak, and is not heard from ever again. Like the calls made to Edward Hammond's house, these phone calls are never traced, and the mystery remains as to why people received weird phone calls in the month after Martha's death. The calls were most likely unrelated pranks, but the targeting of Belle Haven residents with what seems to be specific messages about Martha's death would indicate an inside job, which, if you remember what we talked about in the last episode, that's precisely what the police are thinking. By January 1976, they were firmly looking at Thomas Skakel, the last known person with Martha, and in doing so had created a lockdown on the Skakel household. Rushton Skakel Sr., the patriarch of the Skakel family, refused to let the police have access to his son, and unfortunately the stress of it all had put Rushton in the hospital. However, Rushton's reaction reinforced the police belief that they were on the right track now, and that the Skakel family were keeping secrets about what happened to Martha. So in the last episode, we talked about how the police were now fully focused on Tommy Skakel. The police knew that Tommy was not being honest about his interactions with Martha, or any other aspects of the evening, but they had nothing directly tying him to the murder. Physical evidence was non-existent, as Martha's murder predates most of the forensic tests that we rely on today, and the murder weapon, which came from the Skakel home, was a golf club that had been regularly left lying around the neighbourhood, meaning that anyone could have picked it up and used it to kill Martha. According to the live-in tutor, Ken Littleton, he had seen Tommy at about 10:20 on the 30th of October, and that's sort of midway through the time period the murder could have occurred. Tommy seemed fine and was wearing the same clothes as he had at dinner. The police never examined these clothes, but in fairness, forensic examination was limited, as mentioned earlier. Tommy had taken 2 polygraphs, he had passed one, and the other was inconclusive. What the police needed was for him to either slip up and therefore prove he was lying, or outright confess. The police had managed to have some access to Tommy's school, the Brunswick School, before Rushton Skakel had withdrawn his permission. They found out that the Abraham Lincoln report, the homework that Tommy had said he had to complete on October 30th, didn't actually exist. Tommy's teacher didn't give him that or any other assignment that week. The teacher, Barbara Train, and her husband, Cuthbert, had both taught Tommy. Her husband had seen him act violently towards another student and thought that Tommy was unwell. Barbara Train had a lot of sympathy for Tommy feeling that he was a bit lost and sad, but she also said that he could be, quote, volatile and easily provoked. She also stated that Tommy was lazy and spoiled, which fit in well with what she described as the anti-intellectualism at the school. The Brunswick school had more of a focus on athletic achievement and partying, and we now must talk about the school sports, as it may be connected to Martha's murder. So on the day Martha died, Tommy had gone to soccer practice with Coach Boynton and the rest of his team. Coach Boynton and Tommy had a good relationship. He'd actually helped out a lot with the Skakel children when their mother died. But he was actually quite cross with Tommy this day because Tommy had not been attending practice, which of course is really important when you join school sports teams. And he was actually looking at kicking Tommy off the team. Tommy was really good at sports. It was pretty much the thing he was best at, and he begged to stay. And Coach Boyne decided that it was up to the rest of his team if they were okay with Tommy staying or if they wanted him to leave. He asked the team to vote, and the kids unanimously voted for Tommy to be dismissed from the team, causing Tommy to leave the school crying. This all happened just a few hours before Martha died, and when hearing this story, the police were wondering, was this the trigger? Was this rejection, followed by perhaps another rejection or altercation with Martha, what led to her death? The police had also found more evidence to support the rumour that Tommy was violent and prone to bad behaviour. Tommy and his younger brother Michael had always been prone to tantrums and fighting, particularly with each other. Both would be off school for weeks at a time, and as a result were 2 years behind at school, hence why police were told that Tommy struggled and would not be able to lie to them. Their mother's death had obviously impacted these issues, but apparently they were happening long before she died. In 1971, when Tommy was about 12 and Michael was about 10, and this was roughly 2 years before Anne Skakel died, they were sent to a psychologist called Dr. Ellen Bloomingdale, as their behaviour and fighting was causing so much trouble in the household. Some of the report made by Dr. Bloomingdale was made available over the course of the investigation into Martha's murder. The summary included both Tommy and Michael and described them as having impulsive personalities, poor ego development, bad self-image, sexual immaturity, emotionally blocked. They both suffered from alcohol and drug problems, which, bearing in mind they're 12 and 10 at the time, and that despite the boys being likeable and athletic, they were described as lost and disorganised. Similar to Dr. Bloomingdale's assessment, after Martha died, Tommy underwent some more psychiatric assessments with Dr. Stanley Lessie. He also interviewed the rest of the Skakel family. His assessment of Tommy and Michael was, quote, exceptionally difficult children who suffered from remarkably similar behavioural disorders, end quote. The assessment of Dr. Lessie was part of the police investigation. Back in February 1976, after Rushton had removed police access to Tommy, the Greenwich police were given a profile on the murder of Martha by the same psychiatrist who profiled the Boston Strangler. The profile reads as follows: teenage white male with an explosive temper. They may have hang-ups about girls. An athletic boy. He may be impotent. The killer was not in their right mind at the time, and they killed meaninglessly, like stepping on a bug, and they have probably blocked it all out. Detective Steve Carroll does not believe someone could forget this, but he takes the suggestions that Tommy submit to a series of psychiatric tests, and he approaches the Skakels to ask if they would submit Tommy to them. However, since the Skakels are withdrawing their involvement with the police, they are not sure if they'll even be able to request this. So on February 18th, Steve Carroll goes to meet with the Skakels, but they send representatives, not the family lawyers, or even Tommy's defence attorney. They send their family priests. Yes, you heard that correctly. Father Connolly and Father Geenan were sent to hear what the police wanted and report back to Rushton Skakel. The detectives explained that they wanted Tommy to take some tests recommended by a psychiatrist, but first they wanted to speak to Rushton, explain the tests and the point of them, to hopefully obtain permission. The police told the priest that they just needed Rushton to come in for a meeting first to discuss this with them. Father Connolly said that he, quote, would see what he could do, end quote, and would ask Rushton. However, Father Geenan felt the tests would be not too good for Tommy. I understand that within the Catholic Church, the priests are figures of authority, and in situations like Tommy was facing, a devout Catholic family like the Skakels would of course get help from their church. They would seek that support and they would probably ask for guidance. But I don't understand why the priests were representing the family and gatekeeping access to them in terms of a murder investigation. That seems outside of the remit of what priests do. Steve Carroll was a Catholic himself, so he maybe didn't find this as weird as he would see them as authority figures. But from the perspective of murder investigation, it's very confusing. There's a 15-year-old child who's been murdered, and now there's lawyers, a school with its own lawyers, and the church protecting Tommy, saying that he's too sensitive to be involved in this investigation. According to Steve Carroll, the Skakels made huge donations to their church, which may explain the close connection and the willingness to step in and help. But it feels like everybody's kind of lacking compassion towards Martha. She's been murdered, her family want answers, and the police are just trying to do their job, and yet everybody is stopping Tommy from having to talk to them. The idea that the Skakels paid off the police or the prosecutor is plausible, but when he already has his school defending him, a high-priced attorney defending him, and now the Catholic Church is getting involved, they don't really need to pay off anyone else. Tommy is very well protected from having to face any kind of investigation. However, the priest did tell Rushton about the meeting and seemed to encourage it, as on the 25th of February 1976, Rushton went to speak to the police with Father Connolly and Father Geenan, as well as Emmanuel Margolis, Tommy's defence attorney. They said that they would discuss the police requests amongst themselves and that Margolis would give them an answer once they've made a decision. They eventually agreed to do so, and Dr. Lessie's assessment that was mentioned earlier, it actually occurs on the 24th of March 1976. Tommy is injected with sodium pentothal, which is known as truth serum, and asked a series of questions. Although Dr. Lessie concludes that he doesn't believe Tommy was responsible for Martha's death, he does make the earlier statement about him and Michael being exceptionally difficult. Worse still is that Tommy's responses to questions asked are horrifying in the context of Martha's murder. So I'm going to read you a couple of examples of his answers. The first part is the sentence he needs to complete, and the second part is how he responds. So the first sentence is, when she refused him, and Tommy's response is, he slapped her. The second sentence is, a man would be justified in beating a woman who, and then he responds, did not do as he said. So the two sentences read, with Tommy's endings, when she refused him, he slapped her, and a man would be justified in beating a woman who did not do as he said. Now, obviously, these statements are not an admission of guilt and could be a reflection of more traditional misogynistic views of the time than anything connected to Martha. But still, that's a worrying response. But Rushton Skakel Sr. took the doctor's assessment less as a suggestion and more of a total exoneration of the crime. He neglects to submit the findings to the police, but willingly shares them with his neighbour, Sissy Iggs, and the Moxley family. On the 28th of March, he actually went to the Moxley house and told them about the tests. He told them that Tommy was exonerated. The Moxleys asked him to leave. For me, this really exemplifies how self-involved the Skakels are. To burst into the Moxley home less than 5 months after they've lost their child under horrific circumstances, he acts like this is completely the end of the issue. In fairness to Rushton, he may have just been trying to make them feel better, that it wasn't a neighbour or a friend that did this, or to bring them some form of closure. But it's so egregious. He himself had just had a memorial service for his wife to commemorate the 4th year of her passing, a loss that he had not processed well and was still affecting his whole family. And yet he couldn't comprehend the Moxley sense of loss and that this was too soon and a completely inappropriate move. Not to mention that this did not actually exonerate Tommy. The assessment was helpful, but the police had not been given this information at this point, and they had more work to do before they could officially eliminate Tommy. Either way, Rushton felt it confirmed his son's innocence. The people of Greenwich disagreed. In the winter of 1976, Tommy Skakel attended a family funeral in Ireland, and when he returned from this trip, he transferred to a school in Vermont to finish his education there. Despite the ongoing meetings with police, etc., he was kind of removed from Greenwich not long after Martha's murder, and therefore removed from the scrutiny of the people of Greenwich. But this fueled the rumours further. The gossip around town was that he'd been sent away due to his involvement in Martha's murder. The combination of the funeral trip and moving schools made them think that he'd been absent at a really suspicious time. So after these meetings in February and March, the police would only see Tommy sporadically. According to Detective Carroll, they tried to catch Tommy around town where they could chat to him over a beer. He never gave them any more information though, and they had to leave it where it was. The police had not found the missing piece of the puzzle to tie Tommy to Martha's murder, but he remained a top suspect for police as they could not eliminate him either. However, as the investigation progressed in 1976 and 1977, he would soon be joined on the suspect list by another member of the Skakel household, the tutor, Ken Littleton. The story of how Ken Littleton became a suspect in this case starts in March 1976, when Donald Brown, the Fairfield County State's Attorney, announced that, quote, a particular family was impeding the investigation. It was clear he was talking about the Skakel family, despite not mentioning them by name. The Greenwich police, however, insist they could solve this case. Tommy was their guy. It was just a matter of time. John McCreet, who, if you remember, was a colleague of Martha's father, David Moxley, felt that the police were overestimating their position. The current group of detectives investigating the case had never actually solved a murder before, so how would they know what to do? He also felt that they could be out of their depth simply by the fact the main suspects were powerful and influential people, who, according to the state attorney, were blocking progress. McCreet used his contacts at Detroit Police to orchestrate a meeting between Greenwich Police and the experienced Detroit detectives. They investigate approximately 200 homicides a year and would be able to see if there was anything that Greenwich Police could have done differently or missed in Martha's case. February 4th, 1976. Detectives Lunny and Carroll fly to Detroit. The case file is handed over to the Detroit detectives for review. They praise the Greenwich Police for a decent handling of the case and agree that the most viable suspect is Tommy Skakel. This must have been a relief, or at least some vindication, for Greenwich Police, as they were hugely criticised for handling the case even at this stage. The Detroit detectives also profiled the killer as being from the neighbourhood, i.e. from Belle Haven, known to the victim, and was a troubled person with an explosive temper who would probably do this again. March 31st, 1976. The Detroit Police helped Greenwich further by sending their Major Crimes Unit Commander, Gerald Hale, and Inspector John Locke to assist with the investigation. They assessed the case and tried to move it forward by reviewing the evidence and re-interviewing some key witnesses. They compiled what was known as the Hale Report about the crime. Gerald Hale re-interviews Helen Nix and Jeff Byrne and concludes that Tommy and Martha were play fighting and making out, causing Helen and Jeff to leave when they did. And the last that they saw, Martha was on the ground and Tommy was on top of her. Hale goes on to state the case against Tommy. He was the last person to see Martha, that there was a sexual undercurrent of the meeting that could indicate some form of motive. He had a history of violence and he had lied to police about that night. Hale also states that he has heard the tapes of Tommy's polygraph and feels, quote, professionally, it did not clear anyone of anything. It seems that he's alluding to the questions being asked by the examiner not being conclusive in terms of their content, regardless of what Tommy's physiological response was. Hale concludes that the connection to the murder weapon and being with Martha that night means that the Skakels were the most likely to have been involved in the murder, and that the Greenwich Police needed to be more forceful with the Skakels, that they should have gone into the Skakel house the very next day and searched for bloody clothes and the missing piece of the murder weapon, rather than allowing Julie to search for this later on. Hale states that a search warrant should have been issued, and even at this late stage, 5 months after the crime, he thought it was worth getting one, as the weapon handle and the bloody clothes had to be somewhere. Criticisms of the police were for just failing to tackle the Skakels head-on and not moving on them immediately. He felt that Edward Hammond and the other residents were a strange diversion from the obvious starting point, which was the Skakel family. No warrant had been issued, as they had signed a consent to search form, which basically means that they gave the police permission to look around their house. And Hale was confused by this. If they were initially cooperative, then why not do a formal search right at the start? And if they had then refused something, the police could have applied for a search warrant. He feels that they were, quote, treading lightly with the Skakels. A lot of the police report confirms Hale's assertion that the police were not aggressive enough with the Skakels. In addition to having lunch there a lot and letting Julie Skakel search for the missing part of the murder weapon, other Skakel-related opportunities were missed. For example, police were told that on the morning of the 31st of October, around 4 hours before Martha's body was even found, Stephen Skakel told a friend that he had heard a scream the night before. When news got round of Martha's death, the friend notified the police that Stephen had heard a scream. So the police asked Rushton about it, and he said he would speak to Stephen. Rushton then reported to the police that it was not a scream. What he actually heard was Martha laughing as she went home from the Skakel house. The obvious question to ask here is, why would Stephen Skakel tell a friend about hearing someone laugh? Why would that be something to tell? Why would he remember that? Whereas a scream, even from before the context of Martha's body being found and her being murdered, that's something memorable. It might have even scared him, and that's why he mentioned it to his friend the next morning. This laughter story seems like a classic Rushton Skakel denial, but the police didn't dispute it, they let it go. Similarly, when the police interviewed Dan Corner, who was the man seen by Charles Morganti on the night of the murder, he gives an account of his evening, and he's known to jog in the dark around Belle Haven, so the police don't really view him as a viable suspect. He's kind of like crossed off their list. But they do, however, ask him about his neighbours and if he suspects anyone. Mr. Corner indicates that he is a little concerned about Skakel and Terrian children. He feels the children are out of control and appear to be high a lot of the time, on pills, according to him. He also felt that the Terrian kids could be violent. So although Dan Corner was not a witness to the murder, he does, along with a few other people in town, tell the police he's concerned about the Skakel children. And despite these reports and the connection to Martha, they are still treated more like witnesses than suspects. And I should be clear here, Greenwich suspected Tommy, but I think Belle Haven kept pretty quiet about the Skakel's behaviour to the police. So Dan was one of the neighbours who spoke out a little bit, and it was kind of dismissed. 6 months after the murder, on the advice of the Hale report, the Greenwich police request a search warrant for the Skakel home from Donald Brown. And he refuses. I have no idea why. It makes no sense and really does nothing to fight the accusations that he is in some way coerced or paid off by the Skakel family. But to be entirely fair and balanced, Donald Brown has always said that he just never felt there was enough to go forward with the Skakels. So now we get to the second suspect of the case, Ken Littleton. Ken was the live-in tutor at the Skakel home on the night Martha died. As mentioned previously, October 30th was his first night working at the Skakels. Prior to living at the Skakel home, Littleton was a science teacher and coach at the Brunswick School, which Tommy and Michael Skakel attended in 1975. He graduated from Williams College and apparently he entered the NFL draft and was selected by the Chicago Bears. I cannot find confirmation of this, but I read about it and I was very excited as I'm a massive New York Giants fan and living in England, the Bears are one of the few teams I've actually got to see. I'm currently wearing a Bears hoodie actually as I record this episode, and I will post a picture of Morty in a Chicago Bears hat. But I couldn't find any confirmation of his draft pick, so I just wanted to include it because I'm excited. Anyway, back to the point. In 1975, Ken Littleton was 23 and working at the private prep school, Brunswick. He knew the Skakel children as both a teacher and a coach, and when Rushton Skakel Sr. was looking for a tutor, he hired him to stay at the house and help the kids with their studies. Predominantly Tommy and Michael, as they were about 2 years behind their peers in terms of the work they were doing. So Ken moves in on October 30th, 1975, and of course, as you know, Martha is found dead the next morning. Ken remains at the Skakel house for a few weeks and then leaves their employment and goes back to teaching. But in 1976, when the police are wondering how they can get more information on Tommy without Rushton Skakel's help, but with the backing of the Hale report that they need to look closer at the Skakels, they decide to go search for Ken Littleton, and they find out that Ken Littleton has gone off the rails. Nantucket is an island south of Cape Cod in Massachusetts and is known as a beautiful summer holiday destination with sandy beaches and historic homes. Greenwich residents frequent Nantucket in the months of July and August, and back in 1976, concerns were being raised by the locals about one former Greenwich inhabitant who had been working on the island. The police learned that Ken Littleton has been drinking heavily since Martha's murder and has been behaving erratically. He has spent the last 2 summers working on Nantucket, and he was arrested in the summer of 1976 for a string of burglaries and thefts there. He lost his job at the Brunswick School due to these burglary charges. This information is interesting to the police for 2 reasons. This could be the key to finding out what happened the night Martha died. Would Ken be willing to tell what he knows for some, quote, help with those pesky burglary charges? Or is this behaviour and sudden downfall actually a manifestation of his own guilt? Was Ken keeping secrets of his own? This was not a new idea. People like Sissy Ix, the Skakel's neighbour and friend, had told police she was suspicious of Littleton from the start. This seemed less to do with Littleton in connection to the murder and more to do with not approving of his behaviour in general. Sissy felt he was a better suspect than Tommy. Ken Littleton had told police that on the night Martha died, he had taken the Skakel children, Andrea Shakespeare and Jimmy Terrian to the Belle Haven club for dinner. They all returned to the Skakel house and the kids continued to party while he went to unpack his stuff in his new home. He spent the rest of the night in the house, except for when the nanny, Margaret Sweeney, asked him to check outside as the kids were making a ruckus, but he didn't see any of the kids and stayed by the door and quickly returned to his room. He seemed reluctant to go outside due to the cold and dark, and like everyone else who speaks of October 30th, he said he felt scared. After 10 p.m, Tommy joined him while he was watching the French Connection movie. He said Tommy seemed his usual self and that he was wearing the same clothes as earlier in the night. Ken Littleton also told police that he did not know Martha. He said he didn't meet her when she went to the house that night. Presumably he was upstairs unpacking and the kids were in the driveway, sat in the car. He says he doesn't know what happened to her. Michael Skakel has said that he pointed out Martha to Ken Littleton, telling him he had a crush on her. But Ken only saw Martha briefly, he never spoke to her. But Ken doesn't remember this interaction, only Michael. It seems like Ken would have no reason or opportunity to be involved in Martha's death, but he was almost uniquely placed to know if anyone in the Skakel house was the killer. First time police approached Ken Littleton, they speak with him at the Brunswick school, where he returned to teaching after the Skakel tutor job ended. His reaction to the police is very odd. He's actually quite defensive. He doesn't ask for a lawyer or deflects guilt in any way, but he refuses to help them, quote, build a case against Tommy. The police insist that they just need his help about what he knows, but Ken Littleton seems convinced they are trying to arrest Tommy, and he firmly believes that Tommy is innocent and doesn't want to help them. I find this really interesting, as his wariness towards police does not seem to be related to him being guilty or that fear of them suspecting him. And he seems to be so confident that Tommy is innocent, he won't even talk to them about Tommy. To me, this speaks to Ken's innocence in this crime. He was not worried about himself, presumably because he knows that he didn't do it, there's no evidence to convict him. But he is worried for Tommy. He feels that Tommy is being wrongly accused, and he doesn't want to be involved in the process. If you imagine how a guilty person would behave in that situation, this is a very different reaction. He's defensive, but about Tommy. It's almost like he doesn't trust the police and he is concerned for an innocent person, but he doesn't seem to even consider himself a suspect. There is also the possibility that he does suspect Tommy, or even someone else in the house, but doesn't want to get the Skakels in trouble. Either way, he doesn't seem to care about them talking to him. He's not involved. The reaction that he has leads police to think that he's protecting Tommy and that he does know something about this. But Ken was adamant that he only knew that Tommy couldn't have done it. So at this point, the police start to investigate Ken, as he was acting defensive and, of course, in Nantucket he'd had trouble with the law. Is this more than just defence of Tommy? Captain Keegan felt that Ken was unlikely to be involved in this crime, but he may know something that he was reluctant to talk about. Whereas Detective Carroll thought it was slightly more than that, and that perhaps he helped or assisted Tommy, as Detective Carroll really thought Tommy was the culprit. This idea that he may have been involved or had knowledge was made worse when, on October 18th, 1976, Ken Littleton took a polygraph test and was asked questions specifically about Martha's murder. He did not pass. His lawyer advised him not to take a second one. I spoke in the previous episode about how things affect a polygraph, and I think Ken is a classic example of this. Aside from the examiner error that can be a factor, Ken had been diagnosed with paranoia and bipolar disorder, and both these conditions have been known to affect the results. Ken was also on and off medication for these conditions, and so if he had become medicated in 1976, then that could have also affected this outcome. What we do know was that Ken was drinking heavily and on cocaine in 1976, and again, these could have affected measuring his physiological responses accurately. In addition to the physical and mental factors, he may have appeared deceptive due to having suspicions about people involved. He may not have known what happened to Martha and thought Tommy was innocent, but if he suspected someone else or knew something he was scared to talk about, this could cause his reaction to look deceptive, and boom, that looks like guilt. He was also scared of the Skakels, which we will talk about later, so he may have good reason to keep his mouth shut and again could look suspicious as a result. So his polygraph could have failed for any or a combination of these reasons. It doesn't necessarily indicate guilt. In 1977, he was offered a plea deal for the Nantucket burglaries if he helped with the Martha Moxley case. He was given 5 years probation for the crimes, but was promised a better deal if he would go to Connecticut and submit to a truth serum interview. The same sodium pentothal that was given to Tommy. Littleton refuses and receives his 5-year probation. Why does he refuse? Is it possible he killed Martha, or does he have concerns about what would happen if the Skakels knew he was helping the police? His behaviour in Nantucket over the summer of 1976 indicated he had changed a lot since the previous summer. People who lived and worked in Nantucket saw Ken return as a new person, one who was arrogant, rude, obnoxious and loud. His drug and alcohol use was blamed for this. Cocaine is well documented for damaging the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia and the extended amygdala. This reduces impulse control, making the user more prone to irritability and aggression, as well as long-term use can cause paranoia and even psychosis. That isn't all the symptoms that cocaine can cause, and it's certainly not uniform. There are other factors. But these side effects and heavy drinking could account for Ken's sudden change in personality. But the police were wondering if there was more to it, or if the reason he even started drinking and taking drugs was down to being in Belle Haven October 30th. Steve Carroll felt that Ken Littleton was not a malicious person, that most of his problems were caused by his poor mental health and that was being exacerbated by drug use. But had something triggered this? People in Nantucket had seen a very different side to Ken, a violent one. So in the summer of 1976, when he was out in a nightclub with his girlfriend, he had been drinking, he was on drugs, he was on the dance floor with his girlfriend, and a lady bumped into them. And she apologised, as you do, but this turned into a massive argument with Ken, and it ended when he hit her, he backhanded her across the face and knocked her to the ground. The next day, he went to apologise for the woman. It was a terrible apology, along the lines of, yeah, I shouldn't have hit you, but don't bump into me, kind of thing. But he did apologise. Still, this was a violent attack on a woman, and so it begs the question, has he been violent with women before? Ken Littleton's life starts to fall apart around 1977. He moves on to work in a new school after losing his teaching job at Brunswick. He starts work at St Luke's in New Canaan, about 15 miles away from Greenwich. The headmaster believes Ken Littleton is an excellent teacher, but visits from Greenwich police make him nervous and he fires Ken. It is not the last time he loses a job due to Greenwich police, and he continues to move from job to job and his life becomes increasingly more chaotic. Coach Boynton, who we talked about earlier, Tommy's soccer coach who knew Ken Littleton, had told Timothy Dumas, author of Greentown, how he felt the police had ruined Ken's life and that there was no way he could be involved. But despite Coach Boynton's views, scrutiny from the state's attorney office will follow Ken Littleton for the next 20 years, largely due to the failed polygraph. But for now, let us return to the investigation in the 1970s. Donald Brown stated in 1976 that short of a confession from one of the suspects, this case was dead. His department would transition into focusing on Ken Littleton, while the police would continue to suspect Tommy. So why did the case go cold? Police were not comfortable investigating the Skakels and only really looked at them after the murder weapon was linked to them, despite Martha spending her last hours with the Skakel family. Investigative reporter Len Levitt, who wrote the book Conviction: Solving the Moxley Murder, he believes that police were not complicit in a cover-up. He argues their lack of progression with the Skakels, especially in the first week where evidence gathering is crucial, was either a mistake or due to fear. They were nervous to examine the Skakels and didn't have any evidence to link them aside from the murder weapon that could have been used by anyone and didn't specifically tie them to it. Equally, they had not investigated a murder before, and so they may have made a mistake in just not focusing on the family who were with Martha that night, in favour of exploring the idea that a stranger got into Belle Haven. More experienced detectives would have realised that immediately, hence the Hale report and the Detroit detectives saying focus on the Skakels. The bigger issue in the case going cold was the discrepancies between what the police thought and what State Attorney Donald Brown thought. Brown believed that as Tommy passed his polygraph, but Ken Littleton failed, that Ken had knowledge of the crime, whereas the police felt that Tommy was the best suspect and wanted to pursue that line of inquiry. However, Brown would not give them a search warrant or request a grand jury to review the evidence to see if they could indict Tommy. He actually removed Detective Steve Carroll from his office for suggesting that idea. These decisions led to Brown being accused of being paid off by the Skakels, but he has always maintained that he didn't feel confident enough to proceed with the evidence they had. He felt it was not enough. So no other leads, just Tommy and Ken, and not enough evidence to charge either of them. The media were not convinced. June 24th, 1977, the New York Times wrote about the murder and included the Skakel name, saying the murder weapon had been linked to them. Meanwhile, the local papers report on the idea that the police are protecting the influential, not just incompetent, but protecting the elite. Martha's murder had even been compared to the infamous Chappaquiddick incident, where a young woman called Mary Jo Kopechne had died in a car crash involving Kennedy family members. I will do an episode on Chappaquiddick, so I won't get into details here, but suffice to say that Kennedys were highly criticised for the death of Mary Jo and yet faced little accountability for it. The papers were making an obvious connection between the Skakels and their more famous cousins, and these horrific events seemingly not having resolution and being part of the, quote, curse. Greenwich had already seen a Skakel scandal be covered up by police. Stephen M. Barron Jr., a retired chief who lived in Belle Haven around the time of Martha's murder, had been in charge of Greenwich Police when, in 1966, a 6-year-old girl had been killed in a Skakel vehicle. George Skakel Jr., brother of Rushton Skakel Sr., had a daughter called Kathleen, known as Kik. When Kik was 16, she had taken several children for a ride in her new car, and was bouncing on the speed bumps to make the car jump. Hope O'Brien had been sat on the top of the back seat in Kik's car, and unfortunately she flew out and hit her head. She would later succumb to these injuries. Many people in the community held Kik responsible for the death of Hope, and I do understand that, she was driving the vehicle. But the police chief, Stephen M. Barron, did not charge Kik with anything, and worse still, he went out in public and blamed speed bumps for this incident. Now, I personally see this as a horrible accident. I don't think Kik had any intention of hurting the children, and some of them were perhaps a bit too young to realise the dangers and protect Hope. And Kik, being a teenager herself, was not as careful as an adult would be. But I do understand the arguments both for and against her being held responsible. And although none of this was malicious, she could be charged with vehicular homicide. It's possible the evidence doesn't quite meet the standard for a charge like that in the state of Connecticut, and that's maybe why they didn't proceed. But blaming speed bumps rather than having some form of accountability, or at the very least using it to teach children and teenagers about dangers of playing with vehicles, seems illogical. That's a bizarre take on the situation. And it's understandable that the people of Greenwich felt like he was paid off, that the Skakels had prevented this from going any further. This incident is one of the many reasons why the Greenwich community assumed Kennedy relative would not be charged with Martha's murder. If it was Tommy, he was going to get away with it. So that is where we are as we near the end of the 70s. 2 suspects and seemingly nowhere to go. The investigation impeded by the rich and powerful Kennedy relatives. Ironically though, it will be another Kennedy scandal that re-energises this case. An unrelated event that occurs in Florida that leads the media and police asking a very strange question. Could a Kennedy, and not a Skakel, be Martha's killer? Join us in the next episode for another deep dive into the police investigation, where we'll take you through to the 1990s in our 5th episode of Mystery on Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley murder. But for now, thank you for listening to True Crime with Morty. Please like, comment and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Goodbye from me, and goodbye from Morty.